I'll share my screen in one moment. So the presentation deck I've got is typically to introduce people to, things like the benefits of childcare. Like I say, most of you will probably already know those, but I will cover them at a high level and get through to kind of more the financial focus stuff. Let me just share my screen. Can you see that okay? A nod, perhaps. Yeah, perfect. So of course, like I say, really just focused around demystifying, say the word properly, childcare here. Um, High level, I'm Jordan, father of one. This is Raphael, my son here. We're dressed up at the moment to go to quite well, a birthday event. Um, the kid's my world. I absolutely love him. And so a lot of what we're doing on a day to day is hopefully creating change within and around the childcare sector to impact families today, but ultimately, for the future. So I am founder of Kinsail. A large part of what we do is work with organizations, parents, and nurseries to reduce childcare cost and help parents connect to all the benefits which sit in the billions that are available for them that they just aren't accessing, unfortunately. I'm also a proud member of Parenthood Ventures, which is a community that come together to help one another in terms of building businesses to support parents, but also raise investment for the sector and awareness for the sector to solve more problems. So at a high level, I'll cover, why use childcare. Most of you already know that. Some of the benefits. There's some interesting stats in terms of the impact around children, but also parents, the impact it has there. The available childcare, again, high level because it looks like you're mostly all using it. Some considerations that were important for us and things that you might also want to consider. And funding, where I assume we'll spend the bigger part of the conversation here today as well. Um, so at a high level, we don't need to spend much time here, but parenthood is incredible. It's predominantly 80-20 immense joy for us all, right? And I hope so. These early moments that we spend with our children are the memories that they'll carry for the rest of their lives. And same for us. It makes a huge impact on us. Um, and our children will just develop phenomenal amounts at this point. So in terms of some of the choices we make for them, it's pretty important that we utilize the right resources to kind of give them the best chance that we can in life. Um, but there are challenges. I'll go high level here because it's predominantly finance, but I laugh at most of these because every parent I speak to has the same problems. Yes, expensive childcare, but we all have the same problems day to day with dealing with children that are just unruly, that won't eat their dinners, that causes stress in a million types of ways. Whilst we're going through this transition, like I personally myself was a guy living with seven other people when I found out I was having a child, right? So I was going through this evolution mentally as well when having a child, also whilst juggling how do I afford to do this effectively. Um, so when we look at why you use childcare or why we should use childcare, um, the main reasons are really around development. There's nothing scientific here that people don't know. It's really good for your child to be there because they develop their social skills, they develop the confidence and a lot of the executive skills that they'll take through to later life with them. It provides that environment where it's okay for them to take risks, to learn, etc. But on the flip side of this, it's actually really important for us, and a lot of people forget that. Um, like I mentioned, parenting or parenthood is very hard, and especially for women. It's very tough on the body, the mind. Um, and so childcare is really important because it offers that break. It offers that time to be able to reconnect with yourself and re-energize, for example, not just so that you can get back to work and other things. I think it's really, really important that people see childcare for this as well, and not just a means for the child's development, which is obviously, of course, equally important. Um, it's statistically proven that when you use childcare, if you compare parents that do and don't use childcare, there's a 40% reduction in anxiety just for those that take up childcare, for example. It's proven to improve your mental health and your general physical health. But as an overall, I say work here, it does improve your productivity as a general rule because you have more fulfillment in your own life. I think companies spend like hundreds of millions trying to improve productivity at work, but what they're missing is actually, you get a 20 to 30% productivity increase by supporting working parents with childcare. that most people are missing. So that's a little bit of what we're doing at Kinsail as well, is trying to drive that transition or that evolution in the workplace. Lastly, if you're happy with yourself, and I'm sure you'll all know this, but the happier you are with yourself and with your own life, of course, the bigger impact that has with you and your child's relationship. They pick up these things from you ongoing, but they'll get better quality time overall. For the child, of course, we've kind of touched on these a little bit, but it's yes, the social side of it. It enhances their ability to be able to learn. Like children are statistically proven to do better academically when they start off at childcare. It's because they start compounding on things like numeracy and literacy skills, as well as those executive skills I mentioned earlier on. And so yes, childcare is good for the reasons that we mentioned, but it is ultimately an investment in your child's future, because you'll hear me stress or curse about how expensive it is, but it ultimately does have a good outcome.
Jordan, can I
Yeah,
ask? I know that we're meant to sort of wait for questions, but just in the context of how you're defining childcare, is
please.
that particularly nurseries? I know that the session was a focus on nurseries, or would that count nannies or other ways of providing childcare? What in particular is
Yeah,
that?
good question. There's a funny saying as well. There's always saying like when questions come up, it's usually on the next slide. So in terms of childcare choices, like there's different ways to look at this. I've used multiple. On the fixed side, we've got public childcare. This is funded by the government. I think it was John Prescott back in the 90s that pummeled money into this. It's a lot cheaper as an option, but there's kind of pros and cons to it. Yes, it's much friendlier on your bank balance, but depending on your working schedule, it can be quite hard on you because they run predominantly in term time, so 38 weeks a year instead of the traditional 48 that others do. And they're typically 9 till 3. So unless you've got a job that's 9 till 3 and 38 hours a week, it's a bit of a juggling act for you, regardless of the fact it's cheaper. We've of course got private, which is like the most used nursery services or childcare services. These are owned, they're effectively businesses. They have heavy amounts of investment going into them as well as government subsidies, and they deliver phenomenal care. Like we use this today for my son Raphael. The problem is, of course, it carries an expensive price tag, which causes a lot of burden and a lot of stress for parents ultimately. We also have playgroups. So we use these around nursery and also on weekends. And what I mean by that is not just parent-led musical classes, but kind of like structured things like gymnastics and things like that. I also classify that as childcare because some of the subsidies actually still work towards it. So it's not just a financial burden or stress that you have to cover yourself. It is officially classed as a form of childcare. And so in terms of your question, Prinkia, on nannies, that sits on the more flexible side naturally because you're kind of more in control of when you use these services. They're phenomenal. I've used one for the first year of my son's life, and that one-to-one attention that they get is just phenomenal for development. Like I highly recommend it. The problem is that it comes at a very high cost, as you'd expect. So we paid in the region, I think, of about £18 an hour. Plus, we had to pay for things like lunch and activities and things like that. So unless you've got quite a flexible bank balance, it's something that's still at the moment kind of not accessible for all. There are campaigns happening kind of all around the UK at the moment to make it more accessible. And by that I mean unlock funding so that it can be part funded by the government as opposed to just these kind of traditional fixed venues, for example. Last one, really, I won't go into preschool, but childminders. This is a trend that we're seeing across the UK where there's like childminders, perhaps ex-nannies, for example, opening up venues at their home. They are fully Ofsted approved and safe ultimately, but they're just much, much cheaper versions of the fixed childcare that still deliver good quality care, but ultimately a better price. I don't really have any negatives for them. I think they're a great idea. It's a bit of a different setting. You're not dropping them off at a like an official business, so per se, it's like somebody's house ultimately. So it is a little bit different. I hope that answers your question, Prinka, and I'll move on to the next one. Uh, so the negatives of childcare, there are there like the sniffles, the drop off blues. This was my biggest problem with nursery. Like if you are using it, you're probably all laughing because you're thinking, I'm used to all of these. If you're not using it, be prepared. The drop-off blues, I think, is probably one of the hardest things we had to deal with as parents. And I hear this from other people as well, whereby, your child kind of just feels like you're abandoning them and it's really hard emotionally to deal with. And so, as like a recommendation, I always give to parents and even the working parents I deal with kind of day to day with Kinsail, I'd say if you're going to do childcare, start involving your child in that process as well, getting them comfortable and happy with the fact that they're going to be taking this journey, because it just makes that transition much easier. Because then when you're balancing the stress of an emotional child and cost, it can be quite stressful for you. And it's just not healthy for your general mental health. Overall, like, yes, we're paying expensive childcare, so we're not happy when our child comes home ill all the time. I've got lists of different types of child's illnesses that I just weren't even aware existed. Um, but ultimately they're just other considerations. I always flag like the party overload thing, not for the volume of parties, but there is a cost there in reality. Sometimes we'll attend like 4 parties a weekend, unfortunately. And for each one of those, there is a cost associated with it because you have to do presents, traveling, and other things like that. So just keep in mind when you're thinking about nursery, it's not just the cost of delivering them every day. There are the interactions around or expectations around like parties and other things as well that I always advise parents to be considerate of when looking at nursery. How to find childcare? I'd say, but again, most of you've already done this, and so you'll probably agree. Um, Take a moment to kind of define what you need. The cost factor is quite important. So just think about your budget, like what you're willing to pay today, but what would happen if that increased 50%? And that sounds alarming, but my own childcare costs have increased 60% in the last 12 months. And so you've got to be ready for those sharp increases because they're happening all of the time, mainly because the sector is underfunded, but also because of the cost of living crisis we're in at the moment. Those costs are shooting up, and it's causing a lot of problems within the sector. I kind of don't really need to go into the other elements because, like I say, you're already using it. So, childcare in the UK is actually the most expensive in the world, unfortunately. We surpass countries like Australia and America, which were previously ahead of us. And that's again because the last 24 months that it's just been shooting up in price. The whole sector is really confusing when it comes to finances. Like when you look at different websites or you talk to different people will give you hourly, monthly, term time, non-funding, funded. They'll tell you about things like includable items or if perishables are included, etc. And it can get quite overwhelming. The reason for that is because they don't know. There's all different counties and councils that set a rate of which they're going to give money to the nurseries on a kind of a rolling basis. And so they don't really know how much it's going to cost you or how much they're going to be underfunded on an ongoing basis. It's a really, really big problem that is a massive agenda item at a government level at the moment that they're working through. And so this is constantly changing as well. Oh, my screen's not working. So like a cost comparison, some of you might say my nursery is cheaper, and some of you might say it's more expensive. Um, for example, I've just gone kind of off my own and just like the average around London. So like private's about £90 a day. There's typically not any additional cost. The pros are obviously you get good quality education, but ultimately it is expensive. If you're not using nursery, be prepared for the fact that they're not flexible. And what I mean by that is if you do want to take a couple of weeks of holiday, you will still be paying for that childcare, unfortunately. So you do need to factor that into your ongoing budgets as a family. Public is much cheaper. I've seen this go as low as £12 per day. My co-founder uses public and then uses nanny services around it. But in most cases here, you again will be paying for those perishables and other items that your child uses throughout that time. Again, it's relatively unsupportive in terms of the hours that it runs as well. I don't need to talk too much here for the nanny stuff because we've already run through that. I do genuinely believe in the value of nannies, not just for 9 till 5 childcare, but also for wraparound care. I think one of the biggest causes of relationship breakdown is when you don't have time to focus on the development as well. And so I think nannies are important for wraparound care or for daytime care, but also for wraparound care. And so sometimes that more expensive fee is actually an investment, in yourselves and your relationships and things like that as well. And so we do ultimately stress that. So on the funding side, there's a couple here that you're probably already aware of. Like there's the 15 and 30 hours childcare, which is the most common one. And so until recently, that started at 3 years old, until 5. And what that meant was that you get 15 hours of childcare for your child for 38 weeks of the year. So if you use a private nursery, that actually translates to 10 hours over the fixed amount, and it's because they stretch it. This has now changed because we've just had the biggest update in government funding for childcare in quite a while. And so they're extending it right down to a few months old for children because parents of all ages need to go back to work, not just once the child reaches 3, for example. And so as of April next month, they'll be extending the 15 hours down to 2 years old. But it'll be the term after your child turns 2, to be clear. 30 hours will still remain at 3 years and above. And again, it's the term after. And if you're using private childcare, it's not 30 hours, it's actually 20 hours. And I know that's probably a little bit confusing, but again, it's because of the difference in term times. Private go 48 weeks or more, public go 38. So it depends on the childcare choice that you're using, of what hours you'll actually get reflected on your invoice, so to speak. There are financial considerations here as well. If you earn more than £100,000, you don't qualify for 30 hours of childcare. It will just be the 15, which is pretty much for everybody. On the tax-free childcare, this is a 20% saving that you can make on your childcare costs up to £10,000. So perhaps not at this moment, but I'd love to know how many people are using this. I think in general in the UK, we have a 30% take up around it. One, for awareness, and two, because the process around it's a bit of a nightmare. It's a lot of admin. So if you have 10K's worth of childcare, you can use it for private, for public, but also for nannies as well and other childcare activities. So don't limit yourself here. But the process of how it works is you sign up via the government portal, you put money into a pot effectively, and then you provide that code associated to that pot of money to your childcare provider, at which point they would then claim that money. The source of this is ultimately the tax money that you're paying in as a working parent. So that's the condition, is that you have to be working. The workplace nursery, this is what we do at Kinsail, so I won't spend too much time talking about here, and I'm a bit biased, but it is by far the best working nursery benefit out there, and that's just because it encompasses the nursery, the parent, and the employer, and it gets them thinking about how they can support employees. The benefit of it, of using it, is that you save up to 60% of your childcare. So if you're spending, 15 grand, for example, you cut your childcare bill in half in some instances, depending on your child bracket. Your employer does have to endorse it, but it's pretty much an easy sell because for them, it helps keep people engaged in the workplace and it helps reduce costs for their employees. The last one, there are others, but the last main one is universal credit for childcare. It still requires you to be working. But for like the lower earning households, it's that additional support because the government realised, of course, that childcare is expensive and ultimately not everybody can afford it. So they're trying to make it more accessible. I've covered most of these. So the main part here is just try all options. Do speak to your nursery to find out what's available. Do speak to your employer to see if they'll be open to things like the workplace nursery. Most are. Do consider, that 30 hours is not always 30 hours. It could be 20. Some public nurseries, for example, won't actually accept the hours every day of the week. They might want you to pay for half of it full and then use some of your hours to pay for some of the other childcare because they can't pay for it otherwise, like they're struggling. So do be mindful of that. Just parenting resources that I recommend as well. And there's no plug, I have no association to them, but I use these as a parent. I use Bubble, the nanny recruitment platform. I use that for things like date night, for emergency care when I need it if my son's off nursery. My fiance loves and swears by Peanut. For those that don't know, it was kind of like a mummy friend matchmaking app, but it's also got lots of resources. Childcare pediatricians. I'm sure you've already had one on talking, I think you mentioned, but I've used Carrier before. It's text-based pediatrics and it's quite affordable. I have absolute meltdowns when my son's ill, and so this is just really helpful to keep on top of that. Kidsy is really good if you're cost conscious. They're a really cool marketplace that works with brands to take items that aren't no longer going to market, and so they're just significantly reduced. I don't think there's an issue with buying secondhand goods as a parent. Everybody has a first child and thinks everything needs to be new. But kids are going to cost you best part of £250,000 across their life, going up to like 18. And so there's just no need to kind of be pouring out on new goods where secondhand goods or goods that haven't ever even made it to a shop floor are just kind of as good. So being cost conscious is kind of what they do. And personal favorite, like I'm a parent, I hate my kid being in front of the TV. I love Tony. It's like with the characters that you play for your child. But again, they are expensive. So, if you're using the funding correctly, you can reallocate some of those resources to other things that are good for your child's development. Let's open up for questions. I've either done that really rapid or really slow, so apologies either way. But I'm keen to hear, if that was useful, if anybody would like me to expand on anything else or cover anything I've not covered. Does public offer the same number of hours as private? Please feel free
Hi,
to.
Jordan. That was me again. I think actually it might be really helpful to sort of the stuff you mentioned around those different benefits that one could offer, and perhaps like breaking that down a bit for us. It's really overwhelming to for people to try and understand, or at least for me to understand. This may not be everyone's experience on the call, but what might be applicable and what the limits and bans might be for them to try. So, whether that's the workplace benefit, should they be asking their employers and the money that you're meant to put in the spot to get the tax free, like you're putting post tax money into that pot, like how do you claim the tax? Like, so all of those, like how do these mechanisms actually work would be, is that too much, like to maybe go through
No,
or?
I'm happy to, and sorry if I've kind of too high leveled it because we spent a lot of time talking around it. So for us, it's becoming a little bit more normal. But I appreciate like when we first started learning about it all, it was quite overwhelming. So I'll start with the tax-free one. Um,
Sure, sure. Do you want to share your screen again there? Oh, there is another question on, so maybe we can answer that one first since it's from the audience.
Can the tax free? So from our understanding at the moment, because we deal with the workplace nursery benefit predominantly, but from my understanding, it's running alongside the 3 hours that are offered at this moment in time. So to expand on what you've just asked, Sprinker, it's money that you contribute that you've earned post-tax, and then the government top up. So when I say £10,000, you would make up £8,000 of it and then the government would top up the additional £2,000. This is spread out across the year. So as you pay £2,000, the government will top up £500 per quarter, and then that will just roll over, for example. So you can use that together with the 3 hours. Does that make a bit more sense? And is there anything there that I should expand on, do you think?
That was
Yeah.
really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. That was Prista. In terms of like the workplace nursery side of it, there's multiple avenues you can go. Like we're not the only vendor in the market. There's another one called Enjoy Benefits, by the way. We're not shy about sharing that. Like our main goal here is to make sure that parents are accessing the billions that are available to them. The best way to go about it is to visit the website, of course, kinsail.co. You can just have an example of the savings that you might have via the website. You just enter the figures that you're paying for nursery, like a name of your child so that we can see if they're getting 3 hours, for example, and then we'll just give you a saving back off of that. If you think that that's worth it for you, then the next step naturally is to just engage with your employer to let them know the name of us or another benefit provider, for example, to start that process. It's usually pretty quick because, like I say, employers want to save their employees money. Like they appreciate that financial stress is one of the biggest causes of like poor mental health at the moment. And so they're pretty quick to jump on board and help, ultimately. From a savings perspective, like one parent we were working last week had £23,000 worth of nursery costs. And using a workplace nursery, they saved 9.5 grand on their nursery fees, which is not something that we should just kind of overlook, right? So it is quite a big pot of money. Were there any kind of additional questions on top of that? Caroline, does it cost the workplace? No. So the way it works is that even the nursery get a donation as part of it. So the employer will pay £1,200 to the nursery to help with resources and other costs, for example, but they reclaim this from the national insurance saving. So the way it works is that you will enter into an agreement with your employer. Say you're paying £12,000 of childcare to salary exchange £12,000 to pay for childcare instead of being paid into your bank account, for example. And as part of that agreement, the employer then saves on national insurance that they would otherwise be paying for you. So it comes out as net free for them, basically. So it's kind of a no-brainer for employers because it's free to support you. My name is Chloe. I'm on maternity leave for my second child in September. No worries, Caroline. I hope that's helpful. Oh, this is a tough question. So so what are they paying you? £168 a week because there is a minimum, and I think it is around the statutory sick amount because we do work with plenty of parents that are either going on maternity leave or coming back from maternity leave. But my best advice is that you consult your nursery to make sure that you would still qualify for it. So they'll have a form that comes through either at the start of the quarter or the end of the quarter anyway. But you can always speak to the person that handles payroll at your nursery. So I hope that helps. Sorry, that's quite vague. No worries. By all means, like I've left this is my email. If you want to follow up there, I can just go through our notes because we do have information on it. It's just off the top of my head at this moment. I can't specifically remember the figures. So by all means, do send me a follow up, and I can always come back to you on that if that's helpful. Was
On
there
that
anything
note, it
else?
might also be helpful to like send the audience potentially later. I can do that, forward it on the links of these different government websites where they can learn more about what's available in terms
Yeah,
of that and how
absolutely.
to do the process.
Yeah, so if you go to childcarechoices.co.uk or just type childcare choices gov, that'll take you to the main funding page for the government that talks through the 15 hours, the 30 hours, what some of the rules are around when they're making the changes, like April, for example, the extension down to 2-year-olds, the 20%, but also things like the universal credits for childcare and stuff like that. They don't talk about the workplace nursery that much, and that's because they previously had the childcare vouchers, but they were retired back in 2018, and they've been phased out since, basically. So if you still have access to them, you're pretty lucky. Oh, thank you for sharing that, Priyanka. So that's the website link. That's where you'll find out about those other benefits. And you can look at that. That will give you more context about the kind of the workplace nursery benefit.
Another thing I found really helpful on the Kinsail website was the different types of nurseries and the different types of education formats, and so whether that's Montessori or Steiner or any other kind of concepts, and I think that's laid out really well, on the website. So I do encourage you to visit and take a look. So it's that additional lens on the type of education as well.
Yeah, and I think each nursery chain as well, like even the big 25, like they'll cover a lot of them off. Like we use M Family, for example. And so whilst they've created their own curriculum, their curriculum's more focused around covering the early years of school, for example. But they do blend in things like is it like forestry school and Montessori, for example, which is like the more popular education styles. They're all kind of different. So by all means, if you're not using a nursery, do ask when you're exploring it to find out what they offer, what the differences are, for example. It's stuff like children being more attached to nature, children being focused on more like immersive play and being left to themselves. So there are like kind of nuances between them. Is there anything else that I can cover? It doesn't necessarily have to be finance specific. So, yeah, so that kind of comes more into the government benefit side. So if she's working, I mean, she's always entitled to do things like the workplace nursery. There are salary caps. It kind of starts at 20,000, which is not great, but that's because of the tax incentives. Because otherwise you would just use the 20 percent basically, because the saving on the workplace nursery when you earn around 20 to 25,000 pounds comes out about the same as the 20% offered by the government. So even if she has a lower salary, Caroline, she will still have access to the 20% savings offered by the government of that kind of you pay 8K, they pay 2K, for example. You can also have conversations with your nurseries. Pretty much all chains have allocations set aside for like parents on lower incomes and parents that might be struggling, for example. They're there to work with you ultimately. So do have a conversation with them if your friend is struggling, because in most cases they will work with them to help around kind of more flexible fees, for example, or payment schedules. I hope that's helpful. Yeah, good question. You can use a lot of them together. So like the 15-30 hours can be used with a workplace nursery. The 15-30 hours can be used with the 20%, for example. You can't use like a workplace nursery with the 20 hours because they're both tax incentive benefits. So you'd have to weigh up which one's better for you. In Caroline's example of, say, a friend that's like earning, say, 20 to 25K, you're probably better off using the 20% because you don't have to engage your employers and it's pretty straightforward in terms of just logging into the government portal to then qualify for that, for example. We don't deal too much with the universal credit side of it because again, it's kind of on the people that are on the lower earnings side that are using childcare. But again, a lot of those still work with the additional benefits that are offered with the government. So again, it's just your best bet is to go via the Childcare Choices Gov website if you want to look at support around like being a solo parent or kind of a low earner, for example. I hope that's helpful. Is there
Yes,
any
thank you.
questions?
As people are thinking of questions, oh, there it is.
Until what age can I use the childcare vouchers? So yeah, of course, Joe. So Anna just asked, until what age can we use the childcare vouchers and childcare gov contribution? Good question. So it doesn't actually all apply 0 to 5, like things like the workplace nursery benefit, for example, that's strictly kind of 0 to 5. You do get support with your child beyond the ages of 5. So I believe Cora Kids, Bubble allow you to access the 20% government tax savings. And again, like I say, they are campaigning to try and get the 15 and 30 hours extended further beyond so that you can use them for nurseries because outside of expensive childcare, wraparound care is also equally just as big of a problem for parents because that goes right up to 15, 16, depending on how you manage childcare with your child up to that age, right? So childcare vouchers, well, they're predominantly being phased out. Like people do still use them. There are, I think there was one or a couple of providers that still do offer it and they have a license to offer it. But I'm not entirely sure around the legal rigmarole of how long they're going to be able to do that because it is something that they're phasing out and they did announce that back in 2018, kind of 6 years ago now. So um, if you sign up to the workplace child, Caroline asked if you sign up to the workplace childcare and then move employer, does that complicate it? It depends on the agreement with your employer. Like employers will make savings. So they have the ability to cover the fee associated to the workplace nursery that they give the nursery. In some cases, employers ask the employees pass their probation, for example, before they can uptake it, because typically there's higher churn for employees around that point. They do sometimes ask that if the parent leaves of their own accord very shortly after starting it, that they contribute towards some of the cost that they're then paying towards for the nursery. But typically, like the example I shared with you earlier with the parent that saved like 9.5 grand, and it's kind of common around that way, up or down. They've usually justified a big enough saving at that point to then support some of that cost for the nursery as well. So again, so one, it depends on your employer and what their requirements are, and two, yes, they sometimes can, but usually it's kind of covered by the savings you make anyway. So there are safeguards there for you. Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Saw a thumbs up. No problem. Again, like I say, I'll put my email again one more time. If you do have any questions, by all means, feel free to contact me whenever. I'll come back to you with as much information as possible. Day in, day out, what we're trying to do is ultimately make childcare more affordable, to deliver, the same great quality standard that you're all receiving. So if there's anything that's top of mind for you, I might already have answers for it. And if I don't, I'll come back to you at least.
Jordan, just for everyone's benefit, what are the
Yeah.
different things that parents can avail of on Kinsail itself? So there's, I mentioned one was like understanding the different types of nurseries, and so it'll be great if you can sort of talk us through like how parents can use the Kinsail platform to learn
Yeah,
more about what's available.
absolutely. So, of course, we offer the benefit, which is used to reduce childcare, for example. But on the platform, we do post a lot of content as well, not specifically around finances, but we do delve into that as well. We do look at, like financial hacks as a parent, like how can you save money? How can you save for your future? We did an article recently that covered, if you're contributing £300 a month for your child for the next 30 years, that whilst you might only contribute kind of just over that 100K mark, you'll be leaving them £1 million worth of savings, for example. So there's some kind of like financial hacks that we cover in there. But we do also cover regional specific stuff as well. And so like if you live in Kent or if you live in Sussex, just things that you can do within your area that are, free, or um, classes that you can do with your children to connect with other families and other parents, for example. So there is that knowledge hub that we're building out on an ongoing basis. We have also started to build out a partnership network, to bring more solutions and offerings to parents. So that might be around like nutrition, things around like mental health, for example, development of children. And we're bringing to the platform some stuff around like neurodiversity as well, to bring more awareness to that for children. So we have a marketplace for searching for childcare, but that's just under development at the moment. So we'll be relaunching that again shortly, basically.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for, coming on, Jordan, and talking through some of those benefits. There's been a lot of discussions, like I said, on these chat groups as well, on topics such as even the earnings limit, and how that's not quite well thought through, because you could have, two people earning under 100K versus one earning a lot more, and then suddenly they're out of that bracket. So yeah, what are some of these, like, are there other things that people should be watching out for as they navigate this landscape? Like, what are some of these sort of pitfalls of trying to use these benefits, if any, that you can talk through?
Yeah, I mean, childcare in general, like the financing structure of it isn't that well thought out in general. It's under a lot of scrutiny now, and it has been for quite a while to reform it and to sufficiently fund it. And what I mean, for example, is like government funding funds in the region of like £5 to £6 an hour per child, where like the cost of education is actually closer to like going towards £10, for example. And so that's just something to be mindful of. Is like, whilst you might get quoted 3 hours and you might get quoted for a price, most of the time there's a giant mismatch, and you will still be liable for a fair amount of childcare cost. There are things like the fact that, like you just said, like there's £100,000 cap for an individual earner, but you might have a household of like two people with £80,000, for example. So there are like multiple things that need to be rethought of. But luckily, it's becoming more of a hot topic, and the reason for that is it's not just because parents are pushing back as well, but like politicians and employers are. Women in particular are disadvantaged because of the state of childcare, unfortunately, because it's women that fall into the role of primary caregiver typically. And so like trends that we're seeing in the UK at the moment is like there's over 2 million parents forced out of the workplace because childcare is just so unaffordable and it just doesn't work properly with that kind of work, childcare, life care balance. And like 75% of that is women. So we are fortunately, like I say, seeing a good amount of traction in terms of like reforming finance and childcare in the UK. And hopefully we get a little bit more influence from the countries like the Nordics and the Netherlands, for example, where it's a couple of £100 and you can use it more on a full-time basis. So the next couple of months are going to be quite exciting to see what happens because again, like I say, it's pretty much every day it's being discussed in government at the moment.
Okay. No, thanks for that, Jordan. That is helpful. So we'll keep an eye out and yeah, visit the Kinsail platform to learn more as things change.
Absolutely. We'll be talking about it as and when it happens as well. And so even like elements like the new budget, for example, once we are able to unwind that because they're never quite clear, that news and information will be published via our website as well.
And just one last question before we wrap up. I had that earlier on. So the piece around it being 20 hours versus 30 hours for private nurseries,
Yeah.
and you mentioned that's because it's longer weeks that they cover through, and so I suppose there's more terms there. Is it, or how do you sort of, and do they cover the full cost of that 20 hours, or is it subsidized?
Yeah, good question. So like when the government set out the pot of money, for example, let's just say it's 10 million, they work out the average cost of delivery of childcare, like per hour, like I mentioned a moment ago, and then they'll, divide that first the parents to get down to a figure that they believe is what 30 hours of free childcare is. They're basing their model on like the public nurseries that are still offered today that are like 38 hours. Whereas the reality is pretty, like I say earlier, pretty much nobody works a 38-hour year. And childcare is just a lot more ongoing than that. The private nursery sector operates on a 48 week or sometimes even 51 week basis. And so what they do is they take that chunk of money that the government give them and they spread it out over a much longer period of time. And so there's pretty much always confusion between the nursery and the parent because nurseries unfortunately don't communicate it properly, neither do the government, that ultimately the money that they're given is just not 30 hours because they've had to spread it out over the year. And so there's a lot of the time, not just miscommunication, but kind of anger that, you expect to pay maybe £100, £200, and you might have £1,000 bill. Um, Depending on the nursery, like I say, like most private nurseries include perishables and other items. Not all do, so do check that. And it does vary per county as well, because sometimes the council will dictate that the funding doesn't cover certain items, whereas another council might. And another council might take part of the funding to give to nurseries, whereas the other one will just give the full amount, for example. And so there are nuances depending on the county that you live in, the nursery that you're dealing with as well. So I think it's just always really important to ask questions around the financial breakdown and get them to just be really clear with that, because otherwise it can be quite costly for a parent.
No, that's really helpful. So, as a parent who might be considering sending their child to either a public or private nursery, do you have a view of what they should be budgeting for as a full cost per month or per term for nursery? Is that, do you have any sense of what that range might be?
Yes. So again, like the national average is 14,500. I haven't met many parents that are paying less than that, if I'm honest. Like most of the parents that we're dealing with have like two children. So they're dealing with childcare in the region of like 30 to kind of like mid 40,000 pounds, which is just absolutely extortionate when you think about it, that you're paying almost a salary to go to work. Like that's why benefits like the workplace nursery, for example, do exist because it drastically reduces that. Again, I don't want to talk too much about that because it's what we do, but it is helpful. It's also worth wearing in mind, like I get that like it's very expensive and you've got to utilize the benefits the best way you can, but it's also important to remember that while sometimes your costs come out even with one salary, your lifetime earnings and your salary increase is expected to be higher than that. And I think a lot of parents drop out of the workplace that don't consider that they might come back 2 to 3 years later, not have childcare costs anymore, but actually might have sacrificed a lot of their career and potential career earnings. Which again, it perpetuates things like gender gaps and stuff like that, unfortunately. So there just needs to be more education around things like that as well, I think.
Right. No,
On
thank
the
you.
public side, sorry, it is just drastically cheaper. It is just much cheaper. The problem with that is that it can be really hard to get places depending on your area. So I would sign them up in advance, and you might even have to have a match or a mismatch, a mix, sorry, of a bit of private and a bit of public, and maybe even a nanny because you work 9 till 6, and public only goes 9 till 3, for example. So it
Could you give us an example
circumstances.
how public and private could work together? Like what would that situation look like? So what could you do, for example, to benefit from some public
Yeah, absolutely.
childcare?
So my co-founder uses public nursery. So he has his daughter at nursery private 2 days a week, and then he uses the public nursery 3 days a week in the mornings, which runs 9 till 1, I believe. And then in the afternoon, they co-manage the childcare to keep their childcare costs down. They could use nannies, but again, they're just very high in cost. So it's kind of circumstantial. It really depends on your situation, basically.
And
Um,
and is the public nursery access again like a postcode based like schools are, or can you actually access that regardless of where you live, or is it quite a local
Uh,
application?
yeah, got you. So, like my nursery is not anywhere even close. That's maybe a consideration when you're looking for nursery because you might want your nursery in London where you work, for example, because it's easier to drop off and pick up your child, or you might want them at the end of your road because you work from home. It can really vary. Like public, for example, they do consider things like where you live because they don't want people, traveling for miles to take up spaces that are kind of few and far between. Um, but again, it's pretty open. It's really I always recommend to any parent, whether it's nursery or school, get the thing that's closest to you because nobody wants to be fighting through rush hour traffic or dealing with late trains and additional costs because you're late to picking up your child, for example. So that's always a recommendation anyways. Just get as close as you possibly can.
But
Um,
the nursery itself doesn't stop you from applying or not consider you necessarily. Is it? Because I imagine it's quite a competitive or sort of there's a bit of oversubscription to the public nurseries,
yeah, it's not as strict as the schools for
right?
sure. 'Cause, like we're balancing that transition now. My son's about to go to school, and so there it's very postcode orientated. Yeah, again, in my experience, like I'm used to paying for a nursery. So when you're paying, it's almost the same as private school, right? The postcode is less of a consideration because
Got it.
ultimately you're paying for that education and they want your money, right? But the public, again, it is a consideration, but it's still not quite as important as it is for those people that are about to go to school. For example, the school down the road from us is like not you have to live within zero point 0.3 of a mile, for example, of the school, whereas my nursery is 3 miles away. So it's not really as big of a consideration.
I see there's a question on the chat actually.
Yeah, of course. So
So
Cam's asked, I am looking at the page of children choices and I'm slightly confused for the 2-year-old 15 hours childcare. Is it for families or is there a household income threshold? So you do have to be earning a minimum amount. So if you click into it, it should say like what that breakdown is per week or per year as well. Um, and on the top end, I don't think it's capped because we have £100,000 earners that work with Kinsail that are able to access the 15 hours of childcare, for example. Um, in terms of 2 years old, though, however, that starts next month, I believe. That's a new thing. So it starts from April 2024. So if your child, depending when they turned two, it would be the term after. So if it's a January birth, for example, it would be from the 1st of April, right? Which is when it's starting anyway. So does that help, Cam? Awesome. No worries.
All right. Well then, thank you. Thanks, Jordan, for your time today and talking us through this very confusing topic, and for answering all our questions. And if you do have further questions for Jordan, you'd like to get in touch. I think he did pop his email up there, or get in touch with me, and I'm happy to forward that on to him as well and put you in touch. There it is. Perfect. Thanks, guys, for coming on, and wish you a good night. Thank you. Thanks, Jordan.
Amazing. Have a great
Speak
week.
soon.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.